Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. Mr. Al Gore is a former Vice President of the United States, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and the writer of An Inconvenient Truth, the 2006 documentary that brought the urgency of the climate crisis to a greater worldwide audience. As founder of the Climate Reality Project, he continues his advocacy for action through his work as an investor, as a speaker, and as a teacher. To discuss the state of the fight against global warming and climate change, I'm delighted that he's able to join me today at Peking University, where he's been addressing current challenges and the way forward. But before we begin our discussion, let's look at this.
2015 wasn't just the Earth's hottest year on record. It left a century of high temperature marks in the dust. That was the conclusion drawn in a peer-reviewed 300-page report, State of the Climate in 2015, produced by more than 450 scientists from 62 countries.
There is no hiatus, and the multiple lines of evidence suggest that the Earth is warming very clearly. And for instance, the atmospheric concentrations of the CO2 has been rising, and the sea level has been rising, and the temperature of the ocean was also rising, and there is no hiatus.
The report confirmed that in 2015, the annual global surface temperature had hit a record high for the second consecutive year, easily surpassing the previous record set in 2014 by more than 0.1 degrees Celsius. To deal successfully with global climate change needs strong leadership and great political trust. But developed and developing nations continue to be divided on many issues. The Paris Agreement on climate change was reached in December 2015, setting a target of holding the global average rise in temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and preferably below 1.5 degrees. The agreement was a breakthrough for global climate negotiations, especially after the failed climate summit in Copenhagen in 2009, and years of disputes among countries over their respective responsibilities. As part of its role in the global fight against climate change, in September last year, China pledged a 20 billion yuan fund to help other developing countries combat climate change. And developing a low-carbon economy is an integral part of China's sustainable development strategy. China has now become the biggest investor in renewable energy, and it's improving its energy efficiency.
Welcome to Dialogue, Mr. Gore.
Thank you.
Environmental protection has been prioritized on the agenda for many politicians the world over, but I believe it must be a very difficult mission for you personally. Now, can I know how difficult it is and it has been for you to start a passion for reducing the carbon and to reverse the process of global warming?
Well, I'm very optimistic, and one reason I'm very optimistic is because of the great leadership that China has been demonstrating in the world community. I say this not to flatter the country I'm visiting now. It's an honor to be back in China. But the whole world knows that under President Xi Jinping, the policies adopted by China to move toward a peaking of emissions and then a reduction of global warming pollution, along with the introduction of much greater efficiency in the use of energy, electric vehicles, recycling, a green economy. This is a cause for great hope. I'm particularly optimistic that my country, the United States, and China have now joined together in a shared commitment to help lead the world to solve the climate crisis. So I'm very optimistic.
Why did you rate the spirit of cooperation between the United States and China in the Paris Climate Change Summit so highly?
Well, actually, the agreement reached by China and the United States 1 year before the Paris Summit laid the groundwork for the success that all the nations of the world achieved in Paris. China had a particularly powerful voice because while technically speaking you could debate whether China is a developing country or a very wealthy country. It's both. But it has the ability to provide leadership in the developing world. And the old way of thinking about a conflict between the rich countries and the poor countries has been changed, because all countries face a common threat, and all countries can seize a shared opportunity to create millions of new jobs in installing renewable energy and retrofitting buildings and making all of our businesses and industries and farms much more efficient and productive. And I now see, particularly in solar photovoltaic energy and wind energy, the fantastic potential for sharply reducing the burning of fossil fuels, which of course has been the principal cause of the climate crisis. And with China and the United States working together, the world has a very good chance now to solve the climate crisis.
In your wonderful presentation, you particularly shed light on Chile, where 90% even the speed of their using the solar power and the wind energy has been so impressive. What kind of impact will that deliver for developing countries in particular?
There are some areas of technology where research and development produces dramatic advances. If you think about what happened with mobile phones, for example, or computer chips or flat screen TVs, all of a sudden the cost started coming down rapidly, even as the quality went up dramatically. That's a wonderful thing, and it's very exciting and extremely significant that that trend is now characteristic of solar electricity and wind electricity, and now battery storage of electricity. This is a fantastic and very positive development, because it gives us the chance to move far more quickly toward a reduction of global warming pollution than anyone thought was possible just a few years ago.
Mr. Gore, technically, a significant impediment to increasing the share of renewable energy, such as solar and wind, is higher prices in comparison to traditional energy. Without state subsidies, survival of these industries could be problematic. How can one encourage the renewable energy market's competitiveness?
Well, one of the most exciting changes in the last few years is that the cost of electricity from solar and wind is now less than the cost of electricity from burning coal and gas in many parts of the world. And the parts of the world where that's true are growing in number every single month. And when the cost of electricity from solar energy, for example, is cheaper from the cost of electricity from burning coal, then market forces can take over. But should there be subsidies from the government of renewable energy to make that process go even faster? Yes, I would support that. But here's one important thing to remember. If we simply removed the government subsidies for coal and oil and gas, then that would encourage this transition even faster. The world is now subsidizing fossil fuels at a rate 40 times larger than the small subsidies for renewable energy. So there is now a push in the world to get rid of the government subsidies for fossil fuels, and that alone would help speed up this process dramatically.
Let's look at part of the gruesome climate reality today we are facing. Every 24 hours, it seems, our human beings would dump 90 million tons of global warming pollution into the atmosphere. We can hardly accept this if this is true. Do you believe that the majority of the population throughout the world are waking up to this ugly fact, and what can be done to make a change?
I think the world is waking up to it. the numbers have been increasing in recent years from 90 million all the way up to 110 million tons per day. But in the last 2 years, we have not seen an increase. We have seen a very slight decrease last year, even without a global recession or some historic event like the breakup of the former Soviet Union. Those were the last times where there wasn't an increase in emissions. Last year, for the first time, there was a decrease without a recession in the economy. So this is a positive trend. And in answer to your question, yes, I do believe people are waking up both to the danger that we are facing and to the opportunities to boost our sustainable economies and to create more jobs. It is a very exciting set of opportunities. And I think one reason people are waking up is that the extreme weather events connected to the climate crisis are far more common now and more severe. And people see the television news on your network and others, and every night there are all of these climate-related disasters. In my country, we have had 7 once-in-a-thousand-year downpours in the last 6 years. It's just an example of how quickly these changes are coming. And this is making an impression on people. And they're seeing the consequences that the scientists warned us about years ago coming to pass in their own experience now. And perhaps even more important than the realization of the danger is the excitement that people are beginning to feel that we actually can accomplish this change if we put our minds to it.
How you look at the new realities in both the North and the South Pole areas where the glaciers are fast disappearing. Is it true? And what does that mean for global warming? And as well as for water supply? Because I asked one famous China hand from the United States, what would be the biggest challenge and threat for China in the 21st century? And he, without hesitation, said water.
Well, the water cycle of the world is now being disrupted by the climate crisis. And as for the certainty of these changes connected to global warming, of course, for many years now there has no longer been any doubt whatsoever. Of course, some people still believe the Earth is flat. Some people will always have some beliefs that are just nonsensical. But the public opinion polls around the world show that the vast majority of people, and a growing percentage of people in countries all over the world, now understand very clearly that we have to face this. And you mentioned the changes at the North Pole and the South Pole. These are the areas where the temperature increases are occurring most quickly. Not precisely, well, at the North Pole, but on the boundary areas around Antarctica as well. And the melting of the land-based ice is now threatening sea level rises of multiple meters in this century. And some areas of China, some areas of the United States are particularly vulnerable. Miami, Florida in the United States, New York City and Newark, Guangzhou in China, Shanghai, many other areas that have low coastal populated regions are very much threatened by the sea level rise that is driven by the melting of the ice in Greenland in the far north and in Antarctica in the far south.
Last year's G7 summit delivered a very powerful message and political will to the rest of the world about how they are determined to decarbonize the world economy by the end of the century. Does that mean that the low-lying nations will be saved?
Well, I think that a realistic view is that some of the low-lying areas are already being evacuated. There are some regions of low-lying island nations where people have already had to move. There are people who live in low-lying delta areas in Bangladesh, for example, or in Louisiana, in my home nation, where people have already had to relocate because of the rising seas. But the catastrophic changes that would threaten the future of civilization are ones that we still can avoid if we move more quickly. So you cannot say, I wish we could say, but you cannot say that there will not be any harm from global warming. There has already been harm, and there will be more. But we have to face these changes with courage and recognize that the much worse changes that we might not be able to survive are ones that we must avoid by reducing the emissions of global warming pollution, becoming much more efficient in our use of energy, and switching very rapidly to solar and wind and other forms of renewable energy.
Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Al Gore, former Vice President of the United States and Chairman of the Climate Reality Project. We'll be back in a short while. Please stay with us. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you.
Do you think green technologies will be too expensive for developing countries to accommodate?
One of the most interesting facts about renewable energy technology is that the developing countries have the opportunity to leapfrog, to jump over the old technologies and go straight to the new technologies. It is much more practical for them to go directly to solar panels and windmills and decentralized renewable forms of electricity, which are now in most regions of the world cheaper as a source of electricity. So it's very exciting. But the second part of your question, should there be assistance from the wealthy countries to the poor countries and adapting to the unavoidable consequences of some of the effects of the climate crisis? Yes, of course. And this principle has been accepted for quite some time.
Indeed, you put your finger on a very important issue of principles. But in reality, it seems it's difficult for politicians from the West to honor their promises, given the huge pressure from their domestic electorate.
Well, you're quite right that the pressure from voters and publics in the wealthy countries has been increasing because many of them fear that millions of good jobs from the wealthy countries are now being outsourced around the world, and so they put pressure on their political leaders to stop this process, and that's understandable. But in spite of that political challenge, there are funds forthcoming. Some have already been provided, and more should be. I would support a much larger allocation.
Some say a carbon tax is the best solution for climate change, while others argue strongly that the carbon emissions trading is more effective. What's your take?
I favor both mechanisms and have supported both mechanisms. 30 years ago, I was the first that I know of to propose a carbon tax with the proceeds given back to the people, so that the tax on carbon emissions would discourage the emissions, and I still favor that principle. But the political reality in many countries up until now has been that it's very difficult to enact a carbon tax. When I was Vice President of the United States, I succeeded in putting into the first budget that Bill Clinton and I presented to the Congress a carbon tax. And one House of Congress voted yes, but the U.S. Senate voted no. When it became possible to take a different approach that we might be able to get more support for from the other political party, the cap-and-trade approach, I supported that as well. That is the approach that China is enacting starting next year. It's already started in the pilot projects that have been initiated. But I think the countries that are doing the best job, take for example Sweden, have both a carbon tax and a cap-and-trade system. In the United States, we have neither, although some of our largest states, like California, do have a cap-and-trade system. And President Obama has introduced his Clean Power Plan, which is driven by regulations and will cause many more states to adopt a cap-and-trade system.
Oil prices will stay low. Does it mean that the green energy or clean energy sector will suffer a lot?
I don't think so. For one thing, it's very rare to burn oil in order to produce electricity. There are a few examples of that, but not many. The competition for renewables is still from coal and gas. So the drop in oil prices is not really affecting renewable electricity. There are those who believe that it has slowed down the introduction of electric cars when petrol or gasoline or diesel is cheaper. Then at the margin that may have an effect on how quickly people shift over to electric cars. But even there, you see here in China the incentives that the government is providing to switch to electric cars. I wish we had more such incentives in the United States. But electric cars are beginning to get much, much cheaper. And one of the major manufacturers is about to launch a new electric car that has a 400-kilometer range. So the worries about charging in the middle, recharging the batteries in the middle of a trip will be much less. The technology is advancing very, very quickly. Of course, the entire automobile sector is being revolutionized with the introduction of electric vehicles, semi-autonomous and soon autonomous vehicles, shared vehicles, and lightweighting of the vehicles. This is the most exciting time in the history of the automobile business.
On June the 10th, you gave a powerful lecture about climate change, and up to 300 Chinese participants were briefed about some of the implications of some of the amazing visuals you employed, such as those on floods and droughts. Now, were you afraid that some of the young people might have been deterred? Ironically, they would have been scared by the amazing, gruesome pictures about the droughts and the floods. What did you say to them to let them know, yes, we can make a change?
Well, at the beginning of my presentation at Peking University, I told the audience to watch out for some of these images that show the damage that is being done by the climate crisis, and to guard their hearts because hope is on the way. And I have found in giving many, many thousands of these presentations that, yes, people must have hope, and luckily the hope is real. It's just. But in order to mobilize the kind of massive changes that are now necessary, it is also important to communicate the seriousness of the harm we would face if we did not make changes quickly. And some of that harm is taking place right now. So I always warn the audience in advance that some of the news is bad. Some of these problems are real. But don't give up hope. Despair is just another form of denial. Hold on to your hope because help is on the way. The solutions are now possible. And it's exciting to make the presentations here in China because China is helping to lead the entire world toward these solutions.
A lot of these young people who came back from the United States after finishing their academic studies, they came back with ambition to run their startup company. They are computer savvy. They are beneficiaries of the digital technology. In fact, the whole world benefits enormously from the pervasive use of digital technology. Do you believe that, as you mentioned earlier, the use of green technology could help and assist developing countries frog leap and close the gap quickly and more quickly between their countries and the industrial nations in the process of industrialization? Do you think digital technology will be very helpful for the younger generation?
Absolutely. The younger generation here in China is connecting with business opportunities and others in their generation all over the world. And the digital networks that make it possible to gain access to all of the knowledge in the world, they are empowering this new generation to start up businesses, to take existing businesses and make them much more efficient and competitive. And where the climate crisis is concerned, by the way, the effort to become much more efficient in the use of energy and to reduce wasteful burning of energy, these digital technologies are incredibly powerful in giving people a way to see what needs to be changed. I have been very excited in all of my visits to China, but especially this visit, with the dynamism of the young entrepreneur community here in China. It is absolutely incredible. And I think the future for this generation and the future for China is extremely bright, and therefore the future for our world is.
Millions of kids from China aspire to learn more from the United States about innovation. Now, you told the story of JFK in putting the first man on the moon. Now, do you think the political will comes across as one of the most important sources of strength for the young people, and indeed for people in poverty-stricken nations and for industrial nations to make the world more comfortable and to fight the climate change?
Yes, and I think leadership makes a difference. And I think the kind of leadership that President Xi Jinping is offering right now is inspiring to young people. I really do. Speaking for myself, I was 13 years old when President John F. Kennedy announced the inspiring goal of putting a person on the moon and bringing him back safely within 10 years. I remember some of the adults in that day and time being skeptical about that challenge and worrying about how much money it would cost. But my peers were incredibly excited. And 8 years and 2 months later, after President Kennedy issued that challenge, Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. And the moment he did so, there was a great cheer that went up in NASA's Mission Control in Houston, Texas. And the average age of the systems engineers in that room was 26 years old, which means, among other things, that their average age when they heard that challenge was 18. And they changed their lives. They learned how to be a part of meeting that challenge. And I think that's going on right now here in China. I know it's going on in the U.S. The younger generation wants to be a part of meeting the challenge of solving the climate crisis. And it's yet another cause for great optimism.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gore. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.